Welcome back to the sanctuary of the dimmed light. The shadows have lengthened, and the noise of the modern world has finally retreated into silence. Take a moment to settle into your space, adjusting the pillows, finding that perfect stillness. Let your breath become slow and steady, matching the flickering rhythm of a dying candle. I am always curious to know who is sitting with us in this quiet circle. Is it deep night where you are, with the moon watching over your roof? Or perhaps it is a rainy afternoon and you are seeking a warm corner to rest your mind. Please, let us know the time and place of your sanctuary in the comments below. It brings a sense of connection to our solitary journey. But for now, let us leave the safety of your room. Let us travel back in time to a city that no longer exists, a labyrinth of wood and history. We are going to London, but not the city of glass and steel you know today. It is late summer in the year 1666 C, and the city is parched, thirsty, and waiting. Can you imagine a metropolis built almost entirely of timber and pitch, crammed together like dry kindling? The air is hot, unusually hot for September, and a strong wind is blowing from the east. We stand on a narrow cobblestone street, the upper stories of the houses leaning in so close they almost touch, blotting out the stars. There is a smell in the air, the scent of baking bread coming from a small shop on Pudding Lane. But there is another scent beneath it, something acrid, something dangerous. We are about to witness the death of the medieval world and the violent birth of the modern one. We will watch the spark that grows into a dragon, consuming everything in its path. But do not fear the heat. We are merely observers, ghosts in the smoke. Close your eyes now, feel the warmth on your face, and let us walk toward the bakery. The clock tower of St. Margaret's strikes the hour of midnight, ushering in Sunday, the 2nd of September. London sleeps under a blanket of unseasonable heat. The narrow alley of Pudding Lane is quiet, save for the scurrying of rats in the gutters. Inside the bakery of Thomas Fariner, the king's own baker, the ovens have finally cooled, or so it seems. The smell of yeast and flour hangs heavy in the air, a comforting domestic scent. But deep within, the brickwork of the main oven, a single ember glows with a malevolent red eye. It is a tiny thing, insignificant in the grand scheme of the city. Yet, it holds the power of a dormant volcano. Fariner and his family are asleep upstairs, secure in the belief that the fires are out. But the ember falls landing on a pile of dry brushwood prepared for the morning's baking. The wood, dried bone, white by the long, hot summer, accepts the spark eagerly. A small flame flickers into existence, dancing silently in the dark kitchen. It tastes the air, growing bolder with every breath. It climbs the stacked faggots, reaching for the drying flour sacks. The crackle is soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but soon the smoke begins to pool against the ceiling, thick, acrid, and black. It creeps up the narrow wooden staircase, sliding under the door of the sleeping chamber. Farrier wakes with a cough, his throat stinging. He sits up in the darkness, confusion clouding his mind. Then he sees it, the orange glow pulsing beneath the doorframe. He shouts to his daughter, his voice cracking with sudden panic.
Fire? Wake up! Fire!
The household erupts into chaos. They scramble out of their beds, the floorboards already hot beneath their feet. They rush to the stairs, but the way is blocked by a wall of roaring heat. The kitchen below is no longer a bakery. It is a furnace, trapped. With the flames licking at the rafters, they turn to the only exit left, the window. They climb out onto the narrow ledge, the night air cool against their sweating skin. The neighboring house is close, agonizingly close in these cramped streets. Farrier leaps across the gap, landing heavily on the neighbor's roof. He helps his daughter across, her nightgown fluttering in the updraft. But inside the burning house, tragedy strikes its first blow. The maidservant, terrified by the height, paralyzed by the roar of the fire, freezes on the ledge. Farrier screams for her to jump, extending his hand across the void. But she cannot move. She retreats back into the room, back into the smoke. She becomes the first victim, the first name on a list that history will never fully complete. The fire, having consumed the bakery, is not satisfied. It punches through the roof, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The wind from the east catches them, carrying them like fiery seeds to the waiting thatch of the Star Inn next door. The inn sits in the courtyard, its stables full of hay and straw. It ignites with a whoosh that shakes the ground. The fire is no longer a secret. It is a public spectacle. Neighbors begin to spill into the street all, some carrying buckets, others clutching their possessions. The parish constable arrives, looking flustered and out of depth. He orders the demolition of the surrounding houses, a standard tactic to create a fire break. But the homeowners protest, arguing over the value of their property, while the flames creep closer. Time is wasted in bickering, precious minutes that the fire uses to feed. The chaos grows loud enough to wake the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. He arrives on the scene, irritated at being roused from his bed. He looks at the burning bakery, and then at the frantic neighbors. He sees only a small, local fire, nothing to disturb a man of his stature. With a wave of his hand, he dismisses the danger. Peace, he says, a phrase that will haunt his legacy forever. A woman might piss it out. He refuses the order to demolish the houses, fearful of the cost of rebuilding. He turns his back on the dragon, believing it to be a lizard. He returns to his bed, leaving the city to its fate. But the wind does not care for the mayor's opinion. It picks up speed, driving the flames westward, deeper into the dense heart of the city. The fire jumps from roof to roof, traveling faster than a man can run. It finds the warehouses along the river, the wharves of Thames Street. These buildings are filled with the treasures of the empire, but also its greatest dangers. Barrels of pitch, tar, oil, brandy, and coal. The fire hits these stores like a match thrown into a powder keg. Explosions rock the riverside, sending plumes of blue and purple fire into the sky. The heat becomes physical, a solid wall that pushes the crowds back. The woman the mayor spoke of would now need to be a giantess, and even she would fail. The fire has found its voice now, a deafening roar that drowns out the church bells. It creates its own weather system, sucking in oxygen to feed its hunger. The sparks fly across the river, threatening the ships anchored in the Thames. People begin to realize that this is not a normal fire. This is a judgment. They stop trying to fight with their small leather buckets. They start running. The panic begins to ripple outward, fractal waves of fear moving through the sleeping parishes. "The fire comes!" is the cry that wakes the city. Carts clatter over the cobblestones, piled high with furniture and frightened children. The streets become clogged, a bottleneck of humanity trying to escape the heat. Pigeons, reluctant to leave their nests, fall from the sky with scorched wings. The rats, sensing the end, pour out of the cellars in a gray tide. The fire moves with a terrifying intelligence, seeking the driest timber, the richest fuel. It surrounds the church of St. Magnus the Martyr, climbing the stone tower to ring the bells one last time. The stones themselves seem to sweat and crack. Lead from the church roofs begins to melt, raining down like silver tears. It flows into the gutters, mixing with the filth and the water. The river Thames reflects the inferno, turning the black water into blood. London is waking up to its nightmare. The sun tries to rise, but its light is choked by the smoke. Sunday morning has arrived, but there will be no prayers today, only the liturgy of the flame. We pause here, amidst the growing roar and the mayor's folly. The spark has become a beast. The bakery is gone, but the city is next. Rest now, if you can, away from the heat. The fire, now gorged on the timber of the bakery, finds a richer, deadlier meal on the riverfront. The warehouses of Thames Street act as vast, waiting banquets for the flames. Here lies the stored wealth of a trading empire. But in this moment, it is merely fuel. Barrels of brandy and strong spirits explode with concussive force, sending blue and violet sheets of fire rolling across the cobblestones. The air becomes heavy with the sickeningly sweet smell of burning sugar and spices, mixed with the acrid black smoke of pitch and tar. It is a sensory nightmare, a toxic perfume of destruction. The heat in these narrow streets becomes unbearable, hot enough to blister paint 100 yards away. The fire creates a updraft so powerful it sucks the hats off men's heads and pulls small boats toward the inferno. The church of St. Magnus the Martyr, standing sentinel at the foot of the bridge, is no longer a sanctuary. The fire climbs its ancient stones, consuming the wooden scaffolding inside, and then a sight that defies belief begins to unfold. The lead roof of the church, subjected to the temperature of a furnace, begins to liquidate. It does not drip, oh, it flows. A shimmering, silver river of molten metal pours from the eaves, splashing onto the pavement below. It runs down the gutters, hissing violently as it meets the filth and the water. Anyone foolish enough to be in its path is forced to retreat or face a gruesome end. The molten stream reaches the Thames, plunging into the water with a scream of steam that shrouds the bank in white fog. The river itself seems to be boiling. On the water, the scene is one of desperate, chaotic motion. The Thames, usually the artery of commerce, has become the only road to salvation. Thousands of small boats, wherries, lighters, and barges swarm the water like terrified water beetles. They are piled dangerously high with the remnants of lives. Feather beds, chests of linen, musical instruments, virginals, and frightened children. The poor carry their belongings in bundles on their backs, wading into the mud to beg for a boat. The rich offer gold, jewels, anything for a passage to the south bank. But the fire respects no currency. The sparks, carried by the relentless east wind, rain down on the open boats. Household goods catch fire, even on the water, forcing families to push their burning heirlooms overboard. The river is clogged with floating furniture, charred tables and chairs bobbing in the current like strange wooden corpses. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, watches from a boat, his face illuminated by the glow. He sees the pigeons, which we spoke of before, hovering over their burning balconies until they drop scorched. He sees the cat, singed and hairless, hiding in a hole in the bridge wall. The tragedy is total, encompassing every living thing. The fire now turns its hungry gaze toward London Bridge itself. This great structure, cluttered with tall, wooden houses and shops, is a natural wick. The flames leap onto the bridge, consuming the buildings at the northern end. Panic erupts among those trying to cross to Southwark. They are trapped in a bottleneck. Terror, squeezed between the fire behind and the crush of bodies ahead. But then, a small miracle occurs. Years before, a fire had destroyed a section of the bridge creating a gap. This gap, this missing tooth in the bridge's smile, acts as a natural fire break. The flames reach the edge of the gap, roar in frustration, and find they cannot jump the distance. Southwark is saved, not by planning, but by the ghost of a past disaster. But the North Bank has no such luck. The fire, denied the South, turns back inward with renewed fury. It moves west, consuming Cannon Street, creeping toward the great symbol of the city, St. Paul's Cathedral. The sun is high in the sky now. It is midday on Sunday, but there is no daylight in London. The smoke has created an artificial eclipse, a suffocating twilight of orange and gray. People walk through the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, their eyes streaming tears. The roar of the fire is a constant physical pressure on the ears, like the sound of 1,000 thunderstorms trapped in a box. There is no silence, no respite. The city militia stands helpless, their pikes useless against an enemy that breathes air. They try to pull down houses with great iron fire, hooks, to starve the beast. But the fire is too fast, too hungry. It leaps over the gaps before the dust has settled. The King, Charles II, watches from the safety of Whitehall, his face pale. He orders more demolitions, more action, but the chain of command has broken down. Every man is an island now, fighting only for his own home, his own family. The social order dissolves in the heat. Servants abandon their masters. Apprentices flee their workshops. The only law is survival. We watch a family on a barge, drifting slowly downstream. The mother holds a baby wrapped in a wet shawl. The father looks back at the burning skyline, watching his life turn to ash. They are safe from the heat, but they are adrift. London is burning, and the river is the only witness that does not burn with it. The water reflects the apocalypse, doubling the terror. We pause here, floating on the tide, watching the bridge burn. The lead still flows. The sky is still dark. Rest now. In the cool dampness of the river mist, the monster, having gorged itself on the crude wealth of the wharves, now turned its gaze toward a more refined prize. It began to climb the hill, moving away from the river and into the dense, rich heart of the city. Its destination was the financial nerve center of the empire, the street of the bankers, Lombard Street. Here, behind heavy oak doors and iron grills, lay the accumulated fortunes of generations. The goldsmiths and the moneylenders, who had watched the smoke from afar with a detached concern, now felt the heat on their own faces. Panic, usually reserved for the poor in their wooden shacks, suddenly seized the masters of the universe. They scrambled to save their gold, their silver plate, their precious ledgers. But gold is heavy, and the fire is fast. We zoom in on a frantic scene inside a wealthy merchant's house. Servants are rushing to bury chests of coin in the garden. hoping the earth will protect what stone cannot. Others are throwing expensive tapestries out of upper windows, only to watch them catch fire before they hit the ground. The irony is cruel. The very symbols of their power become burdens that slow their escape. A man clutching a heavy bag of sovereigns runs slower than a man with nothing. The fire sweeps into Lombard Street with a roar of triumph. It melts the iron bars of the strongboxes, transforming the carefully minted coins into formless puddles of yellow metal. The liquid gold runs through the cracks in the floorboards, returning to the earth from which it was stolen. The intense heat cracks the stone facades of the grand houses, peeling away the veneer of permanence. The flames then encircle the pride of London's commerce or the Royal Exchange. This magnificent building, the Temple of Trade, founded by Thomas Gresham, stands as a symbol of London's global reach. Its courtyard is lined with statues of England's kings, a stone lineage of power. The fire enters the exchange not with reverence, but with violence. It races through the galleries, consuming the shops filled with aromatic spices from the east and silks from the south. The statues of the monarchs, watching from their niches, are subjected to a regicide of fire, one by one. As the stone expands and shatters, the kings fall. They crash onto the burning pavement, their stone faces turning to dust. It is a terrifying omen for a populace that believes deeply in signs. If the kings cannot survive the fire, what hope has the common man? Only the statue of the founder Gresham remains standing amidst the ruin, a lonely figure in a roofless hall. The destruction of the exchange sends a shockwave through the psyche of the city. It is the realization that the fire respects nothing. It does not care for charters, or royal seals, or bank balances. The wealthy merchants, suddenly homeless, join the river of refugees flowing west and north. They walk alongside their own servants, their fine clothes stained with soot, their wigs askew. In the orange glow of the burning city, the distinction between master and servant begins to blur. They are all just frightened animals fleeing a predator. They carry what they can, which is pitifully little. A silver cup, a portrait of a wife, a favorite book, the things that seemed essential yesterday. The heavy furniture, the velvet curtains, are abandoned without a backward glance. The fire acts as a great, terrible equalizer. It strips away the artifices of society, leaving only the raw human need for survival. We see a wealthy lady sitting on a bundle of rags in the middle of the street, weeping not for her house, but for her lost lapdog. We see a banker arguing with a cart driver, offering a fortune for a ride, only to be ignored. The currency of the city has changed. Gold is worthless if it weighs you down. A wheelbarrow is now worth more than a carriage. Water is worth more than wine. As Sunday turns into Monday, the fire shows no sign of fatigue. It has created its own wind, a firestorm that sucks oxygen from the surrounding streets. The roar is so loud that people have to shout to be heard, even when standing close. The sky is a bruised purple and black, illuminated by the constant, pulsing glow of the destruction. The mesmerizing beauty of the disaster is undeniable. It is a sublime terror, magnificent and appalling. The silhouette of the city is changing hour by hour. Familiar landmarks vanish into the smoke, never to be seen again. The skyline, once a jagged row of gables and spires, is becoming a flat, glowing line. The citizens of London are no longer residents of a city. They are wanderers in a wasteland. They camp in the open fields of Moorfields and Finsbury, watching their past burn. They huddle under makeshift tents, staring at the red horizon with hollow eyes. The psychological shock is profound. They are witnessing the end of their world. The confidence of the rising empire has been shattered in 24 hours. They wonder if God has finally turned his back on London. We pause here. Amidst the fallen statues and the melted gold, the wealth of centuries has evaporated like morning mist. Rest now, knowing that you are safe from the loss. The value of a quiet breath is the only true wealth tonight. The fire, relentless and seemingly intelligent, now turned its gaze upward. It sought the highest ground in the city all, the sacred hill of Ludgate. There, dominating the skyline for centuries, stood the immense, Gothic bulk of old St. Paul's Cathedral. To the terrified citizens, this was more than a church. It was a fortress of God. Its walls were thick stone, its crypts deep and cool. Surely, they reasoned, the fire could not touch the house of the Almighty. This belief in the cathedral's invincibility led to a tragic decision. The stationers and booksellers of Paternoster Row, panic, stricken by the advancing flames, sought a safe haven for their stock. They carted thousands upon thousands of books into the cathedral churchyard. They filled the crypt of St. Faith's, located deep beneath the choir, with precious manuscripts, Bibles, and ledgers. They walled up the doors, sealing the knowledge of the age inside a stone vault. They believed they had outsmarted the dragon. They believed the stone would protect the paper. But fate, in 1666, was cruel and ironic. St. Paul's was old, and it was suffering from neglect. It was surrounded by wooden scaffolding, erected for a restoration that would never be finished. This timber framework, dried by the summer sun, wrapped the stone tower like a wicker cage. It was not a shield, it was a ladder. The fire approached the cathedral on Tuesday evening, carried by the relentless wind. It did not need to batter down the doors. It simply climbed the scaffolding. The wooden poles caught fire instantly, sending flames racing up the sides of the tower. High above the city, the cross on the roof began to glow. The heat generated by the burning scaffolding was intense, superheating the stone beneath. Ancient limestone began to spall, exploding outward in lethal showers of hot chips. But the true horror lay in the roof. Covering acres of the cathedral was a vast sheet of lead, tons of it. As we saw at the bridge, lead cannot withstand such fury. But here, the scale was magnificent and terrifying. The roof began to melt, not in drops, but in torrents. Eyewitnesses described a river of lead pouring down Ludgate Hill. The silvery, lethal liquid paved the streets, glowing red in the dark. It blocked the escape routes, forcing the crowds back. It flowed over the cobblestones like lava from a volcano, hissing and consuming everything in its path. The cathedral was now burning from the top down. The heavy beams of the roof, no longer protected by the lead, caught fire. They burned with a ferocity that turned the nave into a wind tunnel of flame. And then, with a sound that was felt in the chest as much as heard, the roof gave way. Tons of burning timber and molten lead crashed down into the body of the church. The impact was cataclysmic. It smashed through the floor of the choir, punching a hole straight into the crypt below, straight into St. Faith's, straight into the books. The sealed vault, meant to be a sanctuary, became a kiln. The thousands of books, the dry paper, the leather bindings, ignited instantly. The fire did not just burn them, it devoured them. The crypt became a pressurized chamber of flame. The heat was so intense it shattered the stone columns supporting the cathedral. The fire burned there for a week, feeding on the words of theologians and poets. The loss of knowledge was incalculable. Unique manuscripts, records of the city, plays, and histories, all turned to ash. The burning leaves were caught in the updraft of the collapsed roof. They floated up into the night sky, carried by the wind for miles. Imagine the scene in a village outside London, miles away. A farmer walking in his field sees a piece of charred paper float down from the sky. He picks it up, staring at the faint, scorched Latin text. It is a page from a Bible delivered by the wind. The destruction of St. Paul's broke the spirit of the Londoners. If God's house could burn, then nothing was safe. The psychological anchor of the city was gone. The skyline, once defined by the great tower, was now a gaping, fiery mouth. John Evelyn, the diarist, wrote of the stones of St. Paul's flying like grenades. He walked on the hot ashes, his feet burning, weeping for the ruins of Christendom. The light from the burning cathedral was so bright that one could read a letter at midnight in the suburbs. It was a false noon, created by the death of a landmark. The bells, which had rung out over the city for generations, melted in their tower. Their metal joined the river of lead, flowing into the streets. The silence that followed their destruction was heavy and ominous. There was no more time, no more hours to strike, only the timeless roar of the fire. The citizens watched from the fields, their faces illuminated by the death of their history. They saw the silhouette of the ruined arches standing against the inferno like the ribs of a giant beast. St. Paul's was not just a building, it was London, and London was dead. The belief in a divine protection shattered along with the stained glass. They were alone in the dark, facing a force of nature that knew no reverence. We pause here, standing in the churchyard, watching the leads solidify in the gutters. The smell of burning leather and old paper fills the air. The words are gone. The stone has failed. Rest now in the silence of the unwritten page. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wind had been the fire's greatest ally. It had acted as a bellows, feeding oxygen to the furnace and driving the sparks westward. But on Wednesday morning, the air changed. The relentless gale from the east, which had doomed the city, finally began to falter. The roar of the fire, deprived of its driving force, lost some of its terrifying pitch. It was the first glimmer of hope in a week of despair. But hope alone does not extinguish flames. The fire was still a monster, vast and hungry, creeping toward the Tower of London and the remaining suburbs. The methods of the bucket and the squirt had failed. The pulling down of houses with hooks had been too slow. The fire leaping over the gaps before they could be widened. Desperate times demanded a weapon as violent as the enemy itself. The king, Charles Tuku, and his brother, the Duke of York, made the hard decision. They turned to the naviool and to gunpowder. Until this moment, the idea of using explosives in a burning city had been unthinkable. But with the wind dropping, they had a chance to create a break wide enough to starve the beast. Ideally, this tactic required precision, but there was no time for delicate engineering. Teams of sailors, their faces blackened by soot and powder, moved into the path of the fire. They carried heavy barrels of naval gunpowder, rolling them into the ground floors of the condemned houses. Imagine the tension of these men, standing in a wooden house, with the fire only a street away, lighting a fuse. They ran for cover, shielding their ears. Boom! The sound was shocking, a dull, percussive thud that shook the ground like an earthquake. It was not the crackling of timber. It was the sound of war. House after house was lifted from its foundations, dissolving into a cloud of dust and splintered wood. The explosions echoed through the ruined streets, sounding like cannon fire from a naval battle. To the exhausted refugees in the fields, it sounded as if the French or the Dutch had invaded. panic flared again, rumors spread that the foreigners were bombing the city. But this was a controlled destruction, a surgical amputation to save the patient. The gunpowder created vast, flat wastelands of rubble where houses once stood. When the fire reached these gaps, it found nothing to climb. It found no thatch, no timber, no pitch. It found only the flat, non-flammable earth and piles of broken brick. The flames reared up, searching for fuel, but the gap was too wide. The sparks fell harmlessly onto the dust. For the first time since Sunday, the fire paused. The Duke of York was everywhere that day, riding his horse through the smoke, handing out guineas to the workmen. He was no longer the distant royal. He was a soot-stained commander on a battlefield. His presence rallied the citizens. Seeing the king's brother fighting, the fire gave them the courage to pick up their buckets again. They formed human chains along the edges of the fire breaks, dousing any spark that dared to cross. The tide was turning. The fire, deprived of the wind and starved by the gunpowder, began to lose its momentum. It turned inward, consuming what it had already surrounded, but ceasing its rapid march outward. At the temple, the lawyers and students fought a desperate battle to save their ancient hall. They used the gunpowder to blow up the paper buildings around it, saving the stone heart of the law. Near the Tower of London, the garrison blew up the houses on Tower Hill to save the arsenal. If the fire had reached the White Tower, filled with tons of powder, the explosion would have erased what little of London remained. But the gap held. The tower was safe. The smoke began to change color, shifting from the black of burning tar to the gray of smoldering ash. The sun, for the first time in days, appeared as a faint, red disk through the haze. It looked like a bloodshot eye watching the devastation. The heat was still intense, the ground hot enough to burn the soles of shoes. But the terrifying, rushing roar was gone. It was replaced by the sound of collapsing walls and the hissing of water on hot embers. The dragon was not dead, but it was dying. It lay coiled in the ruins, breathing its last, hot breaths. The citizens stopped running. They stood at the edge of the fire breaks, leaning on their shovels, watching the end. Their faces were masks of exhaustion, etched with the grime of a lost city. They had won, but the cost was absolute. They looked out over a landscape that was unrecognizable. Where there had been street soul, there were now only jagged walls and mountains of smoking debris. London was no longer a forest of spires. It was a flat, gray desert. But in the silence that followed the last explosion, there was a profound sense of relief. The air was still thick, but it was breathable. The wind had stopped. The fire had stopped. The great contest between the city and the flame was over. The city had fallen, but the people remained. We pause here In the strange quiet of Wednesday evening, the smell of sulfur from the gunpowder mixes with the smell of ash. It is the scent of a violent salvation. Rest now. The danger has passed. The rebuilding is a worry for tomorrow. Tonight, just breathe the still air. Thursday morning dawned not with the usual clamor of commerce, but with a profound, ringing silence. The wind had died completely, leaving the air still and heavy with the taste of wet ash. The roar of the furnace was gone, replaced by the occasional crack of a cooling stone or the crash of a precarious wall. The citizens of London emerged from their makeshift shelters in the fields to look upon the corpse of their city. What they saw defied comprehension. The medieval labyrinth of timber and thatch, the city of history, had simply vanished. In its place lay a vast, smoking plain of destruction, a landscape that John Evelyn would famously call a hot desert. Those who ventured back into the ruins found a hostile, alien world. The ground was not just warm, it was burning. The heat stored in the cellars and the thick brick walls radiated outward, making the air shimmer. Men tied thick rags around their boots to keep the leather from scorching on the hot cobblestones. Walking through the city was a treacherous navigational challenge. The familiar landmarks, the taverns, the signboards, the street corners were all erased. Without the towering houses to block the view, the sense of scale was completely distorted. One could stand near the tower and see all the way to the temple, a vista of devastation that was never meant to be seen. People wandered dazed and confused, looking for the site of their homes, but finding only heaps of anonymous rubble. This was Cheapside. A man might say, pointing to a pile of blackened bricks. This was the Exchange. Another would whisper, looking at a lonely, broken column. The geography of their lives had been wiped clean. The statistics of the loss, as they began to be tallied, were staggering. 370, 3 acres within the city walls, had been burned black. 13,200 houses were gone, leaving nearly 100,000 people homeless. 87 parish churches, the spiritual anchors of every neighborhood, were reduced to jagged, roofless shells. The great Guildhall, the seat of civic power, stood like a glowing coal, its oak interior completely consumed. And dominating the skyline of this wasteland was the ruin of St. Paul's. It stood like a hollowed-out mountain, its white stone stained pink by the intense heat. The portico was shattered, the roof gone, the crypt exposed to the gray sky. It was a skeleton of faith. Walking near it, one could still see the pools of solidified lead, silver puddles frozen on the paving stones. The smell of the city was a complex, suffocating perfume. It smelled of damp charcoal, all of sulfur, of roasted grain from the granaries, and of melted iron. Yet, amidst this total annihilation, there were strange, small miracles of survival. A statue of Queen Elizabeth, perched high on a gateway, had escaped untouched, gazing imperiously over the ruin. Some deep cellars, sealed tightly, had protected their contents of wine or cheese, while the house above burned to nothing. But these were rare sparks in a dark void. The psychological impact of the hot desert was profound. Londoners, usually so proud and noisy, moved with a hushed reverence. They were mourners at the funeral of their own identity. The social fabric, frayed during the fire, was now completely unraveled. The rich merchant and the poor waterman stood side by side on the rubble, equally destitute. The tent cities in Moorfields and Finsbury grew into permanent encampments. Here, the refugees huddled under blankets, salvaged rugs, and pieces of canvas. The king, true to his actions during the fire, rode out to these fields. He spoke to the people from horseback, assuring them that the fire was an act of God, not a plot by the French or the Papists. He brought biscuits from the naval stores, a meager offering, but a symbolic one. He promised that the city would rise again, that he would not abandon them to the winter. But looking at the smoking plain, such promises felt like dreams. How does one rebuild a mountain? How does one replace history? As the sun began to set on that first day of peace, the visual horror transformed again. The glow that had lit up the countryside for 4 nights was gone. London was no longer a beacon of fire. It became a black hole. There were no street lamps, no candles in windows, because there were no windows. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, red wink of a dying ember deep in a ruin. The silence returned, heavier than before. It was the silence of a stopped heart. The city of timber and pitch was dead. The hot desert cooled slowly under the indifferent stars. We pause here, standing on the edge of the ruin. The heat presses against our faces, a ghost of the fire. The magnitude of the blank slate is terrifying. Rest now, in the quiet of the aftermath. The fire had cooled, but the temper of the city had not. In the cold, gray light of the aftermath, grief quickly turned into a hard, sharp anger. It is human nature to refuse the idea of a meaningless tragedy, to accept that the greatest city on earth was destroyed by a baker's negligence, and a strong wind was too painful, too random. The mind demanded a villain, a face to hate, a reason for the loss. And so, the rumors began to swirl through the tent cities of Moorfields like a poisonous mist. Whispers passed from family to family, growing darker with every retelling. It was the French, one man would say, sharpening a stick by the fire. It was the Dutch, another would reply. They threw fireballs into the cellars. It was the Papists. A woman would whisper, clutching her children. a plot to burn us all in our beds. The xenophobia that had simmered during the fire now boiled over into a hunt. Foreigners were dragged from the crowds, beaten, accused of carrying fire balls, which were often just onions or tennis balls in their pockets. Into this atmosphere of hysteria stepped a tragic, confused figure. Robert Hubert. He was a French watchmaker, a man of simple mind and fragile spirit. He was arrested in Romford, fleeing the city, and brought before the authorities. Perhaps out of a twisted desire for attention, or perhaps out of a deep mental confusion, he began to talk. He claimed that he had started the fire. He spun a tale of conspiracy, claiming he was part of a French gang. He said he had pushed a fireball on the end of a long pole through the window of the bakery in Pudding Lane. The authorities, desperate for a scapegoat to calm the mob, listened eagerly. They took him to the ruins of the bakery. The streets were unrecognizable, a landscape of ash. Yet Hubert, seemingly guided by some dark instinct or perhaps just luck, led them to the spot where Farriner's house had stood. "Here," he said, "this is where I did it." It was enough for the judges. It did not matter that his story had holes large enough to drive a cart through. It did not matter that the bakery had no window where he described it. It did not matter that Thomas Farriner himself, the man whose oven had actually started the blaze d'avant, looked at Hubert and said he had never seen him. The city needed a sacrifice. The trial was swift, a formality of vengeance rather than a pursuit of truth. Hubert stood in the dock, looking small and bewildered. He likely did not understand that his confession was a suicide note. The jury, composed of men who had lost everything, saw only the monster they wanted to see. Guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. On a cold October morning, far removed from the heat of September, Hubert was taken to Tyburn. The crowds gathered, not with the usual raucous energy of an execution day, but with a grim, solemn satisfaction. They watched as the cart was driven away, leaving the watchmaker swinging in the autumn wind. As the rope went taut, the city felt a collective exhale. The villain was dead. The plot was foiled. Order, they believed, had been restored. But history is a cruel narrator. Weeks later, after the body had been cut down and the anger had faded, a ship's captain came forward. He provided undeniable proof that Robert Hubert had been at sea when the fire started. He had not set foot in London until 2 days after the bakery ignited. The man they hanged was innocent. He was a victim not of the fire, but of the fear. He had confessed to a crime he physically could not have committed, perhaps because he was insane, or perhaps because the world made no sense to him either. The realization of this injustice rippled slowly through the city. adding a layer of shame to the grief. They had killed a cripple to silence their own terrors. The hot desert of London was not just a physical ruin, it was a moral one. The paranoia did not vanish with Hubert's death. It seeped into the ground, becoming part of the city's foundation. For years, the monument built to commemorate the fire would bear an inscription blaming the treachery and malice of the popish faction. It took centuries for the lie to be chiseled away. But in those first weeks, as the winter approached the survivors huddled in their tents. They looked at each other with suspicion. The fire had burned away their homes, but the fear had burned away their trust. They were alone in the cold, haunted by the ghost of a French watchmaker and the silence of a dead city. We pause here, at the foot of the gallows. The wind blows through the empty rope. The search for a reason often leads to a darker place than the tragedy itself. Rest now, knowing the truth is safe with us. The fire had cleared the ground with a terrifying efficiency, erasing the mistakes of 1,000 years. To the eyes of the visionary, this blackened wasteland was not a tragedy. It was a canvas. It was a once in a millennium opportunity to correct the chaotic, organic mess of the medieval city. Before the ash was even cold, the architects came forward with their scrolls. Foremost among them was Dr. Christopher Wren, a man of mathematics, astronomy, and boundless ambition. He walked through the ruins, his mind not seeing the rubble, but seeing the ghost of a new Rome. He returned to the king within days, carrying a map that was a masterpiece of reason. Imagine looking over the king's shoulder at this document. Gone were the crooked, narrow alleys that twisted like intestines. Gone were the dark, overhanging tenements that blocked the sun. In their place, Wren drew wide, straight boulevards radiating like sunbeams from central piazzas. He envisioned a grand embankment along the Thames, sweeping and open. He placed the Exchange and St. Paul's at the end of long, dramatic vistas, monuments to commerce and faith. It was a city of light, of geometry, of order. John Evelyn, another great mind, presented a similar plan, turning London into a grid of logic. The king, Charles II, was captivated. He saw a capital city that would rival Paris, a stone testament to his restoration and power. The plan was approved in principle. The dream of a modern metropolis hovered over the ruins like a shimmering mirage. But a city is not made of paper. It is made of people, and more importantly, of property. The hot desert was not truly empty. It was a patchwork quilt of invisible rights, ancient claims, and stubborn ownership. The shopkeeper standing on a pile of bricks in Cheapside did not want a grand boulevard. He wanted his shop back. He wanted it exactly where his father and grandfather had kept it. He pointed to a charred stump of wood and said, This is my corner. The surveyor tried to explain the new plan, the beauty of the straight line. But the merchant only saw theft. If you widen the street, he argued, you take 10 feet from my frontage. Who pays for that? The complexity of the land ownership was mind-boggling. Tenants, sub-tenants, freeholders, landlords, all had claims on the same small patch of ash. The survey alone would have taken years to untangle. But London did not have years. It barely had weeks. The trade of the nation had stopped. The ships were idle in the river. The bankers were operating out of tents. Every day of delay was a hemorrhage of wealth that the wounded country could not afford. The pressure to rebuild now overwhelmed the desire to rebuild well. Pragmatism began to win the war against art. The king, sensing the mood of his people, realized that imposing a new map would cause a second rebellion. He could not fight the fire and his own citizens at the same time. And so, the grand boulevards were quietly rolled up and put away in a drawer. The dream of geometry died in the mud. The old street plan, the crooked, medieval skeleton of London, was resurrected. The citizens were allowed to rebuild on their old foundations. Pudding Lane would remain a narrow alley. Thames Street would remain a cramped commercial artery. But while the layout remained the same, the substance changed. The king issued a new decree, the Rebuilding Act. It was a strict code written in the language of fear. No more timber, no more pitch, no more thatched roofs. The new London would be a city of brick and stone. The walls must be thick. The streets must be slightly widened, just enough to prevent fire jumping across. This was the compromise. Wren was denied his perfect city. He would not be the architect of the streets, only of the skyline. He was given the task of rebuilding the churches, 50, one of them, and the great cathedral itself. But he would have to squeeze his masterpieces into the same tight corners as before. The surveyors moved in, staking out the old plots in the ash. It was a chaotic, muddy process. The fire courts were set up to settle disputes quickly, cutting through the legal knots with a sword of necessity. The judges sat on raised benches, listening to the endless arguments over inches of soil. My wall was here. No, it was here. They made rulings that were final. No appeals. The city had to rise. And slowly, painfully, it did. The sound of the saw and the chisel replaced the silence of the ruin. Barges of brick began to arrive on the river, millions of red bricks. The smell of burning was replaced by the smell of wet mortar and fresh sawdust. The new houses rose, uniform, sturdy, and fiercely resistant to flame. They lacked the charm of the old Tudor jetties, but they promised safety. London was molting, shedding its wooden skin for a carapace of fired clay. Wren watched the old chaotic streets reappear, outlined now in brick. He must have felt a profound melancholy. He had offered them paradise, and they had chosen the familiar. But he poured his genius into what remained. He began to sketch the dome of the new St. Paul's. If he could not give them a city of light, he would give them a mountain of stone that would catch the sun. He would build a landmark that would watch over the brick city for centuries. The opportunity for a perfect London was lost, buried under the haste of commerce. But the spirit of the city, stubborn, commercial, and practical, had survived. They didn't want a beautiful city. They wanted their city, and that is exactly what they got. We pause here, amidst the rising scaffolds of the new brick houses. The map of the dream is gathering dust in an archive. The reality is rising from the mud. Rest now, in the safety of the brick walls. The legal battles of the fire courts settled the lines on the map won, but they did not build the walls. For that, London needed muscle, and it needed clay. The years following the fire transformed the city into the largest construction site in Europe. The silence of the ruin was replaced by a cacophony of industry that started at dawn and didn't end until dusk. The river Thames, once the road of refugees, became the artery of reconstruction. Barges arrived daily, sitting low in the water, heavy with their cargo of millions of red bricks. They came from the kilns of the home counties, floating down the river like a red tide. The demand was insatiable. Prices skyrocketed, turning brickmakers into wealthy men overnight. The air of London changed again. The acrid smell of burning was gone, replaced by the pervasive, dry dust of crushed mortar and brick. It coated everything: the clothes of the workmen, the food in the stalls, the surface of the river. London became a city of red dust. But bricks alone cannot build a house. The city needed hands. Word spread across the kingdom that London was hiring. Men poured in from the countryside, masons from the Cotswolds, carpenters from the Weald, laborers from the north. They came with their tools wrapped in cloth, looking for the high wages the desperate city offered. The population swelled with these transient workers. They slept in rough shacks on the outskirts, or in the half-finished cellars of the new houses. The streets were a chaotic dance of carts, wheelbarrows, and shouting foremen. Navigating the city meant dodging scaffolding and avoiding deep pits dug for new foundations. It was a dangerous, vibrant, messy rebirth. And amidst this sea of red brick, one project stood apart in its scale and ambition. The Cathedral. Christopher Wren faced a task that would have broken a lesser man. Before he could build the new, he had to clear the corpse of the old. Old St. Paul's, that Gothic giant, did not surrender easily. Its ruined walls, thick and stubborn, loomed over the site like broken teeth. Wren tried to use gunpowder to bring down the unstable towers, learning from the fire itself. But the neighbors complained of the noise and the shaking ground. So he turned to an ancient Roman weapon. He built a massive battering ram, 40 feet long, tipped with iron. Day after day, 30 men swung the ram against the medieval stone. Boom, boom, boom. It was a slow, hypnotic violence. Finally, the old walls crumbled off, surrendering to the new age. The site was cleared, revealing the bedrock of London. Wren laid the first stone of the new cathedral with little fanfare, but with immense internal purpose. He wasn't just building a church. He was building a mathematical prayer. He envisioned a great dome, a feature unseen in England, that would float above the city like a second moon. But the rise of St. Paul's was agonizingly slow. Funds were always short, dependent on a tax levied on coal entering the port. Every stone had to be paid for by the smoke of the city's hearths. Wren grew old alongside his creation. He visited the site every week, being pulled up in a basket to inspect the work as the walls rose. He watched the masons carve the intricate flowers and cherubs that would adorn the stone. He argued with the commissioners, who wanted a simpler, cheaper design, but he held firm to his vision. The cathedral rose in layers, like a geological process accelerated by human will. Around it, the city was healing faster. The new houses were plain, uniform, built of brick with tile roofs. They lacked the eccentric charm of the old timber frames, though, but they radiated a sense of order and permanence. The streets were paved, lit by oil lamps at night, a first for the city. London was becoming modern. The scars of the fire were being covered up, street by street. But deep in the earth, the layer of black ash remained. Every time a workman dug a cellar, he struck that dark stratum, a reminder that the new city stood on the grave of the old. The people changed, too. The shock of the fire had hardened them, made them more pragmatic. They had lost their history, so they focused entirely on the future. Commerce returned with a vengeance. The shops opened. The taverns filled. The exchange of coin resumed. But the shadow of the dome grew longer every year. It became the sundial of the reconstruction, while the houses were built for business. The cathedral was built for eternity. It was a slow, heavy counterweight to the frantic energy of the streets. Wren knew he might not live to see it finished, but he built it anyway. He built it for the unborn. He built it so that when a traveler approached London from miles away, they would not see a flat plain of brick. They would see a white mountain rising from the red dust, a signal that London had survived the fire and had forged something greater in the furnace. We pause here, amidst the sound of the battering ram and the trowel. The dust is settling. The walls are rising. Rest now, in the patience of the stone. As the brick city solidified, the memory of the fire began to demand a physical form. It needed a tombstone, a marker to show future generations where the dragon was born. Christopher Wren and his brilliant friend, Robert Hooke, turned their minds to this task. They chose a spot just yards from where Farriner's Bakery had stood on Pudding Lane. Here they raised a colossal Doric column of Portland stone, soaring 202 feet into the air. The height was precise, exactly equal to the distance from the base to the bakery's oven. It was a mathematical scar on the skyline. At its summit, they placed a brazen urn of golden flames, glittering in the sun. To the common citizen, it was simply the monument, a memorial to the loss. But to Wren and Hooke, men of the Royal Society, it was something more secret. It was a scientific instrument disguised as a statue. The hollow shaft of the column was designed as a massive zenith telescope. They hoped to use it to measure the movement of the stars, to prove the theories of gravity and the Earth's orbit. Beneath the floor lay a laboratory, hidden from the public eye. The fire had cleared the way not just for new streets, but for new science. It was the Enlightenment rising literally from the ashes of the medieval world. While the scientists looked to the stars, the merchants looked to their ledgers. The fire had taught them a brutal lesson about the fragility of wealth. They realized that prayer was not an effective strategy against combustion. They needed a shield that was made of paper and gold, not just faith. Into this void stepped a man named Nicholas Barbon. He was a physician by training, but a speculator by nature. He looked at the fear that still gripped the city and saw an opportunity. He proposed a radical, calm idea: insurance. Before 1666, if your house burned, you were ruined. It was God's will, and you bore it alone. Barbon changed the narrative. He argued that fire was a risk that could be calculated, shared, and paid for. He set up the fire office in a small building near the Royal Exchange for a small annual fee. He promised to rebuild your house if the dragon returned. It was a gamble, a bet placed against nature. But to make the system work, he needed an army. The city still had no public fire department. So, the insurance companies hired their own. They recruited watermen from the river, strong men with colorful uniforms and leather helmets. But there was a catch, a ruthless capitalist twist. These private brigades would only save the houses that were insured by their company. To identify their clients, they created fire marks. These were heavy lead or copper plaques, brightly painted and gilded. They depicted the emblem of the company, a phoenix, a sun, or a handshake. They were nailed high up on the facade of the new brick houses between the windows. Imagine a fire breaking out in a street in the 1680s. The alarm is raised all, and the insurance brigades rush to the scene with their pumps. They look up at the burning house. If they see their mark, they fight the fire with the fury of men, protecting their employer's gold. If they see no mark, or a rival's mark, they might simply stand back and watch it burn. Or perhaps they would only spray water on the neighboring house that was insured. It was a cold, transactional form of salvation, but it worked. The fire marks became symbols of status and security. To have the badge of the Sun Fire Office on your wall was to sleep soundly. It meant you had purchased a future. This shift was profound. Londoners were moving away from a fatalistic acceptance of disaster. They were entering the modern world of risk management and actuarial science. They were taking control of their fate through contracts. The city was becoming a financial engine, not just a collection of homes. The skyline changed again, populated now by these small, metal guardians on every street. The monument stood tall, watching over a city that was now insured against its wrath. The golden flame at the top was a reminder of the past. The lead mark on the house was a promise for the future. Bourbon became wealthy. The city became stable. The fear of the fire did not vanish, but it was domesticated. It was turned into a line item in a ledger. A merchant could now look at the smoke on the horizon and not see total ruin, only a claim to be filed. It was a less romantic world, perhaps, but it was a world where a baker's mistake would not end a civilization. The paper shield held firm. We pause here, looking up at the golden urn against the blue sky. We see the metal badges glinting on the brick walls. The city has learned to gamble with the devil and win. Rest now, under the protection of the mark. By the early 1670s, the raw scars of the fire had begun to heal under a skin of red brick. The refugees who had shivered in the fields of Moorfields through that first terrible winter slowly drifted back. They returned not to the wooden labyrinth of their memories' but to a cleaner, wider, more orderly city. The Great Rebuilding was declared a triumph of English resilience. The king rode through the paved streets, marveling at the uniformity and the absence of the old, dark overhangs. Commerce flowed once again through the veins of the capital, stronger and more vigorous than before. But amidst the celebrations of the new skyline, a silent, uncomfortable question hung in the air. Where were the dead? The official narrative, propagated by the government and the gazettes, touted a miracle. They claimed that in the greatest fire in history, a catastrophe that erased 13 Zalozan homes, only 6 people had perished. 6. It was a number so small, so precise, that it defied all logic. It became a point of national pride, a sign of God's mercy amidst his wrath. "See," the preacher said, "he took our houses, but spared our lives. But for those who walked the new streets, the math did not add up. They remembered the speed of the fire, faster than a running man. They remembered the sick, the elderly, the infants trapped in the upper rooms of the tenements. They remembered the smell of the burning fat in the air, a scent distinct from timber. The official six were merely the ones whose bodies were found and identified. Foreigner's maidservant, the old man at St. Paul's, the watchmaker. But fire, oh, especially a fire of such apocalyptic intensity, is a great eraser of evidence. It does not just kill, it cremates. It turns bone to ash all, and ash to dust. The temperatures in the heart of the inferno reached 700 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt iron, hot enough to vaporize a human body completely. The poor, who lived in the densely packed cellars and garrets, left no trace behind. They were the invisible victims, the missing thousands, who simply vanished from the census. Records from the time show a disturbing gap. Parish registers, which meticulously recorded births and deaths, simply stop. Families were scattered. Neighbors were dead. There was no one left to report the missing. A man looking for his brother might assume he had fled to the country, or joined the Navy, or started a new life in the colonies. Hope obscured the truth. It was easier to believe they were gone away than to believe they were part of the dust in the mortar of the new houses. The city was built on a foundation of denial. Archaeologists digging in London today sometimes find a layer of burnt debris, the fire horizon. Within it, they find melted pottery, fused glass, but rarely bones. The fire was too thorough. This ghostly census haunts the history of the event. It transforms the Great Fire from a story of property loss to a silent mass tragedy. The survivors carried this knowledge in their hearts, a secret grief they dared not speak against the official joy of rebuilding. They knew that the true cost of the new, modern London was paid in blood, not just gold. The official six stands as one of history's great lies, a comforting fiction to soothe a traumatized nation. But the wind that blows through the new, wide streets carries the whispers of the uncounted, the ghosts of the poor, the forgotten, the vaporized. They are the shadow in the brick. We pause here in the bustling, reconstructed street. The crowd moves past, unaware of the silence beneath their feet. The official number is 6. The true number is known only to the wind. Rest now, and remember the unseen. The years rolled on, and the raw, red scars of the new brick city began to weather. London was no longer a medieval relic huddled within its ancient walls. It had been forged anew in the crucible of 1666, emerging as a prototype for the modern metropolis. The physical transformation was the most immediate and striking change. The Timber Age was over, ended by a single spark. The Brick Age had begun. This shift changed the very texture of life in the capital. The old city had absorbed sound, the wood soaking up the noise of the streets. The new city reflected it, the hard brick and stone echoing the clatter of hooves and the cries of hawkers. The air, for a brief, wondrous period, tasted different. The fire had acted as a colossal, brutal fumigation event. For centuries, the narrow alleyways had been choked with filth, breeding grounds for the Great Plague that had ravaged the city just the year before. The fire had sterilized the earth, burning away the wooden shacks, the rat nests, and the festering middens. It was a cure more terrifying than the disease but it was effective. The plague never returned to London with the same ferocity. The rats found no harbor in the new, solid cellars. The wider streets allowed the wind to sweep away the miasma. Unknowingly, the fire had cleansed the city of its biological shadow. The reconstruction also birthed a new kind of order, a legal and structural discipline. For the first time, a city was built according to a code. The Rebuilding Acts defined 4 rates, or classes of houses. There were strict rules for the thickness of walls, the height of ceilings, the width of windows. It was the birth of standardization, the forerunner to modern building regulations. The skyline became more uniform, a disciplined regiment of chimneys and slate roofs. It lacked the chaotic, leaning charm of the Tudor past, but it projected a sense of stability and power. London was dressing itself in the uniform of an empire. The focus shifted from the intimate and local to the grand and global. The new Royal Exchange opened, larger and more magnificent than Gresham's original. It became the engine room of a trading network that stretched from the spice islands of the East to the tobacco fields of the Americas. The insurance companies, born from the fear of the flames, grew into financial giants. They began to insure not just houses, but ships, cargoes, and lives. London became the place where the world managed its risk. The intellectual life of the city also found a new home in the ashes. The coffee houses multiplied in the new brick alleys. These were not just places to drink the bitter, dark brew from Arabia. They were penny universities, where news was read aloud, shares were traded, and politics were debated. In the smoke-filled rooms of Jonathans or Garraways, the modern world was being talked into existence. Scientists like Hooke and Wren sat alongside merchants and poets. The fire had shaken up the social strata, mixing men of different stations in the common task of rebuilding. This cross-pollination of ideas sparked a different kind of fire, an intellectual enlightenment. The city became a brain, buzzing with information, and watching over it all was the rising dome of St. Paul's. It took 40 years to complete, a lifetime of labor. But as it rose, it became the symbol of the city's resurrection. It was not Gothic, dark and mysterious. It was Baroque, rational, light, and mathematical. It was a cathedral for the age of reason. Its white Portland stone gleamed against the gray London sky, visible for miles around. It told the world that London had not just survived, it had triumphed. The inscription on the monument read, "London rises again. Whether with greater speed or greater magnificence is doubtful." It was a boast, but a true one. The fire had destroyed the physical connection to the past. Old tombs were gone. Old records were ash. This severed the city from its medieval nostalgia. It forced London to look forward, only forward. It became a city obsessed with the future, with growth, with improvement. The tragedy of 1666 was rewritten as an opportunity seized. The pain of the refugees, the missing thousands, was slowly paved over by the march of progress. History is often written by the architects, not the victims. But if you looked closely, you could still see the legacy of the fear. The wide streets were designed to prevent fire spread. The fire hydrants, the insurance marks, the brick walls were all scars of trauma turned into defense. London was a fortress built against its own memory. It was a city that slept with one eye open, watching for the spark. We pause here. In the shadow of the great white dome, the city hums with a new energy, colder, sharper, richer. The wooden dragon is a story for children now. The brick phoenix is the reality. Rest now. In the orderly streets of the new age, the physical city had been rebuilt, but the memory of the fire became a ghost that refused to leave. It seeped into the folklore, the nursery rhymes, and the art of the nation. For centuries, children would sing London's Burning, a simple round that turned tragedy into a game. Fetch the engines, fetch the engines. A playful echo of the desperate screams on Thames Street. Fire,
Fire!
pour on water, pour on water. The trauma was domesticated, wrapped in melody to make it safe for the nursery. But for the artists and writers, the fire remained a sublime terror. Painters depicted the event not as a disaster, but as a biblical reckoning, a scene of awe, inspiring power. The sky in these paintings is always an impossible red. The Thames a river of blood. They captured the feeling of the hot desert, the sense that humanity was small against the elements. Writers like Daniel Defoe and John Dryden used the fire as a metaphor for purification and rebirth. They saw it as the moment London shed its medieval skin and stepped into modernity. The fire became the dividing line in history. Before the fire and after the fire. It was the year zero of the new capital. Let us now, in our imagination, walk the streets of London today. We stand at the foot of the monument, near the underground station. The column still soars, though now dwarfed by skyscrapers of glass and steel. The golden urn still glitters, catching the same sun that once illuminated the ruin. Tourists climb the spiral staircase, laughing and taking photos, unaware they are climbing a scientific instrument meant to measure the stars. We walk down Pudding Lane. It is no longer a narrow, dark alley filled with timber houses. It is a modern street lined with unremarkable office buildings. There is a simple plaque on a wall, marking the spot where Thomas Farriner's oven stood. It is a quiet, modest marker for the birthplace of a dragon. People rush past it with coffees in their hands, checking their phones, late for meetings. They walk over the ghosts of the bakery without a second thought. We move toward the river. The warehouses of Thames Street are gone, replaced by apartments and walkways. But if you look closely at the river wall at low tide, you might see old, blackened stones. The scars of the heat are still there, buried under centuries of mud. We cross London Bridge. It is not the wooden bridge of 1666. That is long gone. But the view toward the city is still dominated by the dome. St. Paul's still watches over the skyline, though it now shares the air with the Shard and the Gherkin. Wren's masterpiece has survived wars, the Blitz, and the March of Time. It stands as the enduring promise of the reconstruction. During the Second World War, when London burned again, a famous photograph showed the dome rising above the smoke. It was a visual echo of 1666, a reminder that the city is unkillable. The fire is no longer a threat. It is a tour guide story. But the legacy is woven into the very DNA of the city. The layout of the streets, the rates of the houses, the insurance industry that rules the city. They are all children of the spark. London is a city built on a graveyard of ash. Every time a foundation is dug for a new skyscraper, they find the fire horizon, a layer of black, a foot thick, running beneath the feet of the bankers and the baristas. It is the carbon fingerprint of 1666. It contains the melted pottery, the fused glass, and the mystery of the missing thousands. It reminds us that our permanence is an illusion. We build in stone and steel, thinking we are safe. But the people of 1666 thought their timber was safe. The fire teaches us humility. It teaches us that a city is not just bricks. It is a collective act of will. It exists only because we agree to live together, to fight the flames together. As we walk back toward the monument, the sun begins to set. The glass towers reflect the orange light, turning the city into a kaleidoscope of fire colors. For a moment, It looks like the city is burning again, but it is just the sunset. The danger has passed into history. The dragon sleeps in the history books, but the warmth remains. The energy of the rebuild, the phoenix spirit, is the true engine of London. We pause here, looking at the golden flame against the darkening sky. The noise of the modern traffic fades into a hum. The ghosts are quiet tonight. They know they have been remembered. Rest now, in the city that refused to die. Our journey through the smoke and fire of London has come to an end. The sparks have faded and the roar of the dragon has silenced. You have walked the burning streets and stood amidst the rising brick. Now, the heat of history gives way to the cool calm of the present. Let the image of the golden flame on the monument be your final thought, a symbol not of loss, but of light. Take a deep, slow breath, inhaling the peace of a city at rest. Release the tension of the days gone by. You are safe, far from the chaos, wrapped in the comfort of this quiet hour. I hope this story of destruction and rebirth has brought you a sense of perspective and calm. Thank you for sharing this twilight journey with the dimmed light. If the story of London resonated with you, please leave a thought in the darkness below, or simply tell us where in the world you are finding rest tonight. Your presence is the quiet heartbeat of this channel. Drift away now, leaving the ashes of history behind. The city sleeps, and so should you. Good night, friend. Until the next story calls us from the shadows, sleep well.